The mud came up to her ankles, and the rain showed no mercy. Margaret Whitfield knelt on the cold stone steps of Ashbourne Hall, scrubbing brush in hand, working at the dried filth caked into a pair of riding boots that did not belong to her, boots that belonged to a man who hadn't even bothered to learn her name. What he didn't know, what he wouldn't discover until the candles were lit the next morning, was that the letter from his own solicitor lay folded and forgotten in the breast pocket of her traveling cloak, hanging by the servant's door. A letter that named her not a maid, not a beggar, but Miss Margaret Whitfield, governess to his only daughter. By morning, the Duke of Ashbourne would walk into his library expecting to greet a stranger of breeding and education. Instead, he would find the very woman he had humiliated in the rain the night before, and by then, it would already be too late to take it back. The carriage had left her 3 miles from the estate, the driver muttering something about the road being too poor for his wheels, and Margaret had walked the rest in shoes that were never meant for mud. By the time Ashbourne Hall rose before her, gray stone, ivy-choked, indifferent to the storm, she was soaked through and shaking, her trunk heavier with every step. She had nothing left to lose pride over. 6 months since her father's death had taught her that. A bishop's daughter did not expect to scrub floors for her bread, and yet here she was, grateful for any roof at all. The man who answered the side door was tall, broad-shouldered, and furious in a way that had nothing to do with her. He did not ask her name. He did not ask why a soaked woman stood shivering on his threshold past dark. He simply looked at the mud on his boots, flung off in irritation moments before, and at her, and made the only connection his exhausted mind allowed. "You're late," he said, voice clipped as a blade. "The hall doesn't pay idle hands. There." He gestured to the boots, then to a bucket and brush left by the door. "See that they're presentable by morning, or you'll find employment elsewhere." Margaret opened her mouth to explain, to correct him, to say, "I am not who you think I am," but the words caught somewhere beneath her exhaustion and her pride. She had learned in 6 hard months that explanations rarely reached men who had already decided what they saw. And there was something in his eyes beneath the irritation that looked like grief wearing the mask of anger. She recognized it. She wore the same mask herself. So she knelt. She scrubbed. The rain found every gap in her cloak, and her fingers turned the color of the dusk, and somewhere above her, through a lit window, she heard a child's voice, thin, careful, almost a whisper, say something to a nursemaid that made the nursemaid sigh with worry rather than delight. A child who barely speaks, Margaret thought, working the brush harder. I wonder what silenced her. She did not know yet that the child was Lucy Hawthorne, the Duke's daughter. She did not know that the silence in that nursery had lasted 2 years, since a fever took the late Duchess in a single terrible week. She did not know that tomorrow she would walk into that very nursery not as a maid begging forgiveness, but as the woman entrusted to bring that small voice back into the world. All she knew, kneeling in the mud with a stranger's boots in her lap, was that pride was a luxury she could no longer afford, and that somewhere behind that cold, hard man's eyes, there was a wound he hadn't let anyone near in a very long time. She had no idea she was about to become the one person allowed to try. She woke before dawn out of habit rather than rest, her body aching from a night spent on a narrow cot in the servant's wing, her hands still raw from the lye soap and cold water. A maid named Bessie had taken pity on her the night before, sneaking her a bowl of broth and a dry blanket, whispering that the master of the house had not always been so hard before grief had hollowed him out. Margaret dressed in her one good gown, gray wool, modest, the only garment that had survived the journey without ruin, and smoothed her hair as best she could without a proper mirror. Today she was not a maid caught in the rain. Today she was Miss Whitfield, governess, and she intended to walk into this house as exactly that. She found her letter of introduction precisely where she'd left it, tucked in her cloak by the servant's door, slightly damp at the corner but legible. She held it like armor as she made her way toward the main hall, following Bessie's directions toward the library, where she had been told the Duke received new staff each morning before breakfast. The door was open. She knocked once out of courtesy and stepped inside. The man behind the desk did not look up immediately. He was writing something with quick, irritated strokes, his dark hair disheveled as though he'd run his hands through it one too many times. "You're the new governess," he said, still not looking up. "I trust you understand the position requires discretion, patience, and a complete absence of nonsense. My daughter has not spoken in 2 years, and I will not have her treated as some curiosity to be coaxed and prodded by every tutor who fancies themselves clever enough to." He looked up. Margaret watched the exact moment recognition struck him, watched his jaw tighten, his pen still mid-sentence, ink pooling into a small black blot on the page. The silence stretched long enough that she could hear the clock ticking on the mantel, the fire crackling, her own heartbeat in her ears. "You," he said. "Yes, Your Grace." She kept her voice level, though her pulse was anything but. "Miss Margaret Whitfield, your solicitor engaged me on behalf of Lady Lucy 3 weeks ago. I apologize for the confusion last night. I attempted to explain, but—" "You said nothing." His voice had gone low, dangerous in the particular way of a man more furious with himself than with her. "You did not ask my name before you gave me an order, Your Grace. I judged it wiser to obey than to argue with a man I had never met, in the dark, in the rain, at the door of a house where I had nowhere else to go." She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. The words landed exactly where she intended them. He stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor, and for a moment she thought he might actually apologize. There was something working behind his eyes, some private war between pride and shame. But the Duke of Ashbourne had spent 2 years building walls precisely so that no one could see him lose a war, and he was not about to start with a governess he'd mistaken for a maid. "You'll find the schoolroom on the 3rd floor," he said instead, cold and formal, as though the previous night had never happened. "Lucy takes her lessons at 9. I expect a report on her progress every Friday. That will be all, Miss Whitfield." Margaret curtsied, turned, and walked out with her spine straight and her chin level, though her hands, hidden in the folds of her skirt, were trembling. Behind her, alone in the library, the Duke of Ashbourne sat back down very slowly and stared at the ink blot spreading across his letter, thinking of muddy boots and rain, and a woman who had kept her dignity in circumstances that would have broken most people he knew. He told himself it meant nothing. He did not yet know how wrong he was. The schoolroom smelled of dust and old paper, sunlight falling in pale stripes across a floor that had not seen a child's laughter in longer than Margaret cared to imagine. Lucy Hawthorne sat at a small desk by the window, her dark hair, her father's hair, pulled into a neat plait, her hands folded in her lap with a stillness no 6-year-old should possess. She did not look up when Margaret entered. "Good morning, Lady Lucy." Margaret kept her voice soft, unhurried, the same tone she might use with a wounded animal that had learned to expect only harm from human hands. "My name is Miss Whitfield. I understand we'll be spending our mornings together." Nothing, not a flicker. The nursemaid who had been minding her, a tired young woman named Agnes, gave Margaret an apologetic look on her way out, as if to say, "I warned you, this is how it always is." Margaret did not push. She had read enough in her father's old correspondence with parish families, in the long evenings she'd spent caring for grieving children in his congregation, to know that silence born of loss could not be commanded into speech. It had to be invited, gently, patiently, on its own terms. So instead of demanding recitations or testing her letters, Margaret simply sat down across from her, opened a book of fairy stories she'd brought from her own meager collection, and began to read aloud, not to Lucy exactly, but near asterisk her, as though reading to herself and simply allowing the child to listen if she chose. Days passed this way. Margaret read. Lucy listened or appeared to, her eyes occasionally drifting to the pages, to the small illustrations of foxes and castles and clever girls who outwitted wicked stepmothers. She never spoke, but Margaret noticed things: the way Lucy's fingers would tighten on her skirts during the frightening parts, the way her shoulders would ease when a story ended happily. She was listening. She was feeling. The silence was not emptiness. It was a door locked from the inside, and Margaret understood with growing certainty that no amount of force would ever open it. Only patience, only safety, only time. On the 5th morning, Margaret brought not a book but a small wooden box of watercolors, salvaged from her father's old study. She set it on the desk without explanation and simply began to paint a clumsy little house, a garden, a sun with too many rays humming under her breath as she worked. Lucy watched her for a long moment, then slowly reached for the smallest brush. They painted in silence together for nearly an hour. When Bessie came to fetch Lucy for her midday meal, the child had produced a small, careful painting of a woman with brown hair holding a child's hand beneath a tree. She did not show it to Margaret. She simply left it on the desk when she rose to go, a gift, or perhaps a confession. Margaret couldn't be certain which. That evening, walking the long corridor back to her room, Margaret passed the library and found the door ajar. The Duke was inside, alone, a glass of brandy untouched at his elbow, staring at nothing in particular. He looked up as she passed, and for a moment neither of them spoke. "She painted today," Margaret said finally, unable to help herself. "A woman and a child under a tree." Something moved across his face, too quick to name, gone before she could be certain she'd seen it at all. "My wife used to take her into the garden every afternoon," he said quietly. "There was an oak. Lucy called it the wishing tree." He looked back down at his brandy. "She hasn't mentioned it since." "She didn't mention it today either," Margaret said gently. "She painted it instead. I think, Your Grace, that some things must be said in whatever language is left to us, when the usual one becomes too painful to use." He looked at her then, really looked, the way he hadn't allowed himself to since that first humiliating night. And Margaret felt, not for the first time, that she had said something true enough to crack the careful armor he wore like a second skin. "Good night, Miss Whitfield," he said, and there was something almost gentle in it. "Good night, Your Grace." She did not know, walking away, that he watched the empty doorway long after she had gone. Mrs. Cromwell had run the household at Ashbourne Hall for 11 years, since long before the late Duchess had arrived as a young bride, and in all that time she had grown accustomed to a particular kind of power, the quiet, absolute authority of a woman who controlled the keys, the linens, the wages, and in a house as grief-stricken and rudderless as this one, very nearly the Duke's own peace of mind. She did not relish sharing that authority with anyone, least of all a governess who had arrived in the mud and somehow, within a fortnight, managed to coax more progress from Lady Lucy than 3 previous tutors combined. It did not help that Mrs. Cromwell had a niece, a pale, simpering girl named Harriet who had trained as a governess in Bath, and was, in her aunt's estimation, perfectly suited to replace the upstart Miss Whitfield the moment a vacancy presented itself. Mrs. Cromwell had been promising Harriet's mother, her own sister, a position at Ashbourne Hall for the better part of a year. She did not intend to let a bishop's penniless daughter stand in the way of a promised maid. She began, as such women always do, with small things. A misplaced book here, a missing ribbon there, nothing that could be proven, only enough to plant a seed of carelessness in the housekeeper's reports to the Duke. She made certain to mention, in passing over his morning correspondence, that the new governess seemed to spend a great deal of time alone with His Grace in the evenings, that the staff had begun to talk. that perhaps it would be prudent to find someone more settled, more known to the family. The Duke, to his credit, dismissed this the first time with little more than an irritated glance. He was not a man given to servants' gossip, and he had built his entire reputation on a cold, deliberate fairness that made his staff both respect and slightly fear him. But Mrs. Cromwell was patient, and patience, in the hands of a woman who had spent 11 years learning the precise architecture of a household's weaknesses, was a formidable weapon. She struck again a week later, this time with something harder to dismiss. It happened on a gray Thursday afternoon, while Margaret was walking with Lucy in the garden. The same garden Margaret had come to learn, with the same ancient oak that Lucy's mother used to call the wishing tree. They had begun, in small increments, to spend their afternoons there, and though Lucy still had not spoken a single word aloud, she had taken to humming soft, wordless little melodies that Margaret recognized, with a private ache, as the beginning of something. A bridge being rebuilt, plank by careful plank. When they returned to the house, Margaret found her small room in disarray. Her trunk had been opened. Her few possessions, a comb, a locket containing a miniature of her late mother, a small collection of letters from her father, lay scattered across the narrow bed, and the locket, the single item of any value she owned in the world, was gone. She reported it immediately to Mrs. Cromwell, who received the news with theatrical concern that did not, for a moment, reach her eyes. "How distressing," the housekeeper said, folding her hands. "Though I confess, Miss Whitfield, it is rather unusual for thieves to trouble themselves with the room of a governess when there is silver enough in the dining hall to tempt them. One does wonder." She let the sentence hang, unfinished, its implication unmistakable. By that evening, the whisper had already begun its journey through the servants' hall, that perhaps the new governess had not lost anything at all, that perhaps she had sold the locket herself, and invented the theft to garner sympathy, or worse, that perhaps the missing item had never existed in the first place, a fiction designed to make herself appear a victim deserving of extra consideration. Bessie, loyal as she was, came to Margaret's room late that night with a candle and a worried face to warn her of the talk circling below stairs. "It isn't fair, miss," Bessie whispered. "Everyone knows Mrs. Cromwell don't take to you, but folks listen to her all the same. She's been here longer than any of us can remember." Margaret sat on the edge of her narrow bed long after Bessie left, turning the truth over in her mind like a stone she could not put down. She had no proof of the theft beyond her own word, no family to vouch for her character beyond a dead father's reputation in a parish 3 counties away, and no power in this house beyond the goodwill of a man who had, thus far, shown her precious little of it. She thought of writing to her father's old curate, of asking him to send some testament to her character, but pride, that old familiar enemy, stopped her hand. She had sworn, the day she left her childhood home for the last time, that she would never again beg anyone to believe in her. She did not yet know that someone in that house already did. The Duke had heard the whispers too. It was impossible not to, in a house where servants' gossip moved faster than any letter. And though he said nothing to Margaret directly, he found himself, against every instinct toward detachment he had cultivated since his wife's death, paying closer attention than he wished to admit. He watched her at supper, when the staff dined together below stairs and he occasionally passed through on his way to the study. He watched the careful, dignified way she held herself despite the sidelong glances and muttered comments, the same dignity she had shown kneeling in the mud the night they'd first met. He found himself, for reasons he could not entirely articulate even to himself, disinclined to believe a word of Mrs. Cromwell's insinuations. But disinclination was not proof, and the Duke of Ashbourne had learned in the hardest year of his life the danger of trusting his own judgment about people. He had trusted his judgment once before, in choosing physicians for his wife, in believing assurances that she would recover from a fever that had, in the end, taken her in 6 terrible days. He had not trusted himself with anything important since. So he did nothing. He watched and waited and told himself this was wisdom rather than cowardice. And in the schoolroom above, his daughter hummed a wordless tune to a woman who might, at any moment, be cast back out into the rain from which she'd come. The locket reappeared, ironically enough, on the same day everything else fell apart, though not before the damage had already been done. It began with an ordinary Tuesday lesson, the kind that had become almost comfortable in their predictable rhythm. Arithmetic in the morning, reading after, and in the afternoon, when Lucy's concentration inevitably wandered, a walk to the garden beneath the old oak. Margaret had brought along a small basket of bread crusts that morning, an idea she'd had after noticing how Lucy's eyes followed the sparrows that gathered along the garden wall, and she thought perhaps the simple act of feeding them together might coax something further from the girls' careful silence. They had barely settled beneath the tree when Mrs. Cromwell appeared at the garden gate, her face arranged into an expression of grave duty rather than triumph, though triumph was unmistakably what lay beneath it. "Miss Whitfield," she called, "His Grace requires your presence in the library at once. A matter has come to light that concerns you directly." Margaret rose, smoothing Lucy's hair back from her face with a reassuring touch, and promised she would return shortly. She did not know, walking that long corridor toward the library, that Mrs. Cromwell had spent the better part of the morning constructing a far more elaborate accusation than mere theft. She had found, or claimed to have found, a letter among Margaret's belongings that suggested Margaret's father had died not peacefully, as Margaret had always believed and always said, but disgraced, dismissed from his parish under circumstances Mrs. Cromwell described with careful, damning vagueness as irregularities in the church accounts. It was, in fact, a complete fabrication, cobbled together from half-truths Mrs. Cromwell had gathered through a cousin who lived 2 villages from Margaret's childhood home, and a healthy dose of malicious invention. But fabrication delivered with sufficient confidence carries its own terrible weight, and the Duke, summoned from his correspondence to hear it, found his expression growing colder with every word. When Margaret entered the library, she found him standing rather than seated, his back to the window, his face unreadable in the gray afternoon light. "Mrs. Cromwell has brought a serious matter to my attention," he said without preamble. "She suggests your father did not leave his position as bishop under circumstances as honorable as you have led this household to believe." The accusation struck Margaret like a physical blow, not because it was true, but because of how thoroughly, how casually it could unmake everything she had spent 6 months trying to rebuild. "That is a lie," she said, her voice low but unshaking. "My father served his parish for 31 years and died of a fever in his own bed, mourned by every family he had ever ministered to. I do not know what Mrs. Cromwell believes she has discovered, but I assure you, Your Grace, it is false." "And yet you have no proof beyond your word," Mrs. Cromwell interjected smoothly, "just as you had no proof of a missing locket beyond your word. One does begin to notice a pattern, Your Grace, of unfortunate claims with no evidence behind them." It was, Margaret would later reflect, the precise moment her pride finally failed her, not because she lacked the strength to fight, but because she understood, with sudden and devastating clarity, that there was no fighting a woman who had spent 11 years learning exactly how to weaponize a household's whispers. She had no family name powerful enough to silence the rumor. She had no fortune to buy loyalty. She had only her word, and her word, it seemed, was not enough. "Then I shall not trouble Your Grace's household any further," she said quietly, drawing herself up with the last of her composure. "I will collect my things and be gone within the hour." She turned to leave, and that was the precise moment the library door, left slightly ajar, swung further open, and a small voice, thin and rusted from 2 years of disuse but unmistakably clear, cut through the room like a struck bell. She didn't steal anything. Every adult in the room turned at once. Lucy stood in the doorway, Bessie hovering anxiously behind her. The girl's small hands clutched white-knuckled around something Margaret recognized instantly. The missing locket, its chain tangled, clearly retrieved from wherever it had been hidden. Lucy, the Duke's voice cracked on his daughter's name. 2 years of silence shattering in a single instant he had stopped believing he would ever witness. "I saw Harriet take it," Lucy said, her voice gaining a fraction of strength with each word, as though speaking itself were a muscle remembering how to move after long atrophy. "From Miss Whitfield's room. I followed her because I wanted to see the sparrows in the east garden, and I saw her put it in her apron. I didn't know what it was. I found it in her room yesterday under her mattress when I was looking for my ribbon." She held the locket out, not to her father but to Margaret, her small arm trembling with the effort of the gesture. "I'm sorry I didn't say anything sooner. I forgot how." The silence that followed was unlike any silence that had filled that house in 2 years, not the silence of grief, but the stunned, disbelieving quiet of a miracle no one had dared to hope for. The Duke crossed the room in 3 strides and knelt before his daughter, taking her face in his hands as though she might dissolve if he held her too tightly or too loosely. "You spoke," he whispered, and his voice broke entirely on the words. "Lucy, you spoke." "Miss Whitfield says some things have to wait until we're ready," Lucy said simply, leaning into her father's hands with the unguarded trust of a child who had finally remembered how to be one. "I think I was ready today, because she was leaving and I didn't want her to." The Duke looked up then, over his daughter's shoulder, at Margaret standing frozen by the door, and whatever composure he had built over 2 years of careful, deliberate distance crumbled in that single look. He understood, with the swift and merciless clarity of a man finally seeing what he had refused to see, exactly what he had nearly thrown away. Not merely a competent governess, not merely a woman wrongly accused. Something far more dangerous to the careful architecture of his grief. A person who had walked into his broken household and, with nothing but patience and quiet conviction, begun to put it back together. "Mrs. Cromwell," he said, rising slowly, his voice gone hard as iron, "you will explain to me, in detail, exactly how my daughter came to witness your niece committing theft in this house, and exactly what you hope to gain by burying that truth beneath a lie about a dead man's honor." Mrs. Cromwell's face had gone the color of old ash. "Your Grace, I—" "Not another word," he said, "until I have heard from Harriet directly. Bessie, fetch her at once." But even as the machinery of justice began, slow and inevitable, to turn against her, Mrs. Cromwell's eyes found Margaret's across the room, and in them was something far more dangerous than embarrassment at being caught. It was the look of a woman who understood she had lost this particular battle, and was already, even now, calculating the cost of the war she intended to wage instead. In the weeks that followed Lucy's first words, Ashbourne Hall transformed in ways no one would have thought possible only a month before. Harriet was dismissed within the day, her thefts confirmed by her own tearful confession once confronted directly. And though the Duke had every legal right to involve the magistrate, Margaret had quietly interceded on the girl's behalf, arguing that a young woman led astray by an ambitious aunt deserved a chance at honest correction rather than ruin. It was, the Duke would later think, entirely characteristic of her, this stubborn insistence on mercy even toward those who had wronged her, this refusal to let cruelty beget more cruelty. Mrs. Cromwell remained, for the moment in her position, though stripped of the easy authority she had once wielded, watched now with open suspicion by a household that had finally seen the shape of her ambitions laid bare. Lucy's recovery, once begun, progressed with the swift and miraculous momentum of a dam finally broken. She spoke haltingly at first, single words and short phrases, but within a fortnight she was chattering at breakfast about sparrows and fairy stories, and the particular shade of blue she intended to paint the sky in her next watercolor. And the sound of her small voice filling the previously silent halls of Ashbourne brought something to her father's face that the household staff had not seen in 2 long years. They began to call it, quietly, below stairs, the thaw, as though winter itself had finally relented. And in the midst of that thaw, something else had begun to grow, slow and unacknowledged, between the Duke and the woman he had once mistaken for a maid. It started in small ways. He began to seek her out in the evenings, ostensibly to discuss Lucy's progress, though their conversations drifted, more often than not, into territory that had nothing to do with arithmetic lessons or reading comprehension. He learned that she had read every book in his late wife's neglected library, that she possessed opinions on philosophy and poetry sharp enough to challenge his own, that she laughed rarely, but genuinely, a sound that surprised him each time with its warmth, when he attempted, clumsily, to be amusing. She learned in turn that the cold, exacting man who had ordered her to scrub his boots was not cold by nature but by grief, that he had loved his wife with a depth that had nearly destroyed him when fever took her, that his sternness with the household was less cruelty than fear of losing control over anything else he might come to care for. "You're afraid of being happy again," she told him once, on an evening when the brandy had loosened his tongue more than usual, and he had confessed, almost against his will, how terrified he'd been of failing Lucy as he believed he'd failed his wife. "Because if you allow yourself to feel anything at all, you must risk losing it again." He had looked at her for a long moment in the firelight, something raw and unguarded moving across his features. "And you, Miss Whitfield, are you not afraid of the same thing?" "Every day," she admitted quietly. "But I have learned that a life spent guarding against loss is no life at all, only a long, careful kind of dying." He did not respond to that, not with words at least, but something shifted between them in the silence that followed, an understanding neither of them was yet prepared to name aloud. It was there in the way his eyes followed her now when she crossed a room, in the way she found herself dressing with more care for their evening conversations than the occasion strictly warranted, in the careful, deliberate distance they both maintained even as the space between them grew charged with everything neither dared say. Mrs. Cromwell, watching all of this unfold with the particular bitterness of a woman who had lost her gambit and intended to lose nothing further, understood with cold clarity that her position in this house was no longer merely uncertain. It was finished, the moment the Duke chose, as he surely would, to elevate a penniless governess above the station she had been born to occupy. And a woman with nothing left to lose, Margaret would come to learn, was often the most dangerous adversary of all. It took Mrs. Cromwell 3 weeks to find what she needed, not a fabrication this time, but something worse, a fragment of truth, twisted just enough to wound. Through her cousin in the village near Margaret's childhood parish, she learned that Margaret's father had, in his final year, fallen badly into debt, not through dishonesty, but through his own boundless generosity, having given away nearly every shilling of his modest living to families in his parish suffering through a brutal winter. He had died still owing money to a local merchant, a debt Margaret herself had quietly settled over the following months by selling nearly everything she owned of value, including, ironically, the very locket Harriet had stolen and Lucy had recovered. It was not a scandal. It was, if anything, a testament to a good man's character and his daughter's loyalty. But truth, in the hands of someone determined to do harm, could be shaped into something else entirely. Mrs. Cromwell did not bring this information to the Duke. She brought it instead to the village 3 miles distant, to the same gossiping circles that had once delighted in Margaret's earlier humiliation, framing the tale not as one of generosity and sacrifice, but of a bishop who had died in disgraceful debt, a daughter who had concealed her family's financial ruin to secure a respectable position in a noble household. A woman, in short, who had lied her way into the Duke's confidence through careful omission. By the time the story reached Ashbourne Hall, as such stories always eventually did, it had grown teeth Mrs. Cromwell had never intended to put there, embellished by every mouth it passed through until it bore only a passing resemblance to the truth. The Duke heard it first from his steward, who heard it from a tenant farmer, who had heard it in the village market that morning. He sat with the information for the better part of an hour before sending for Margaret, and when she arrived, summoned once again to his library under circumstances eerily reminiscent of the Locket accusation, she knew immediately, from the careful, guarded look on his face, that something had changed. "There is talk in the village," he said without preamble, "concerning your father's debts and your reasons for seeking this position. I would hear the truth from you directly, before I hear it second-hand from every tenant on my land." And so Margaret told him, the whole of it. The winter her father had given away nearly everything to keep his parishioners from starving, the debt he'd left behind not from dishonor, but from a generosity that had, in its own way, killed him as surely as any fever. The months she'd spent selling her possessions one by one to clear his name, rather than let his memory be stained by something he would have considered a small price for doing right by his flock. She told it plainly, without embellishment or appeal for sympathy, because she had long ago decided that the truth, however painful, was the only currency she had left to trade in. The Duke listened in silence, his expression unreadable, and when she finished, he said nothing for a long moment, long enough that Margaret felt the familiar cold dread of rejection settling into her chest, the certainty that even truth, however honorable, would not be enough to outweigh the damage already done to her reputation in a village that thrived on scandal. "Thank you for telling me," he said finally. "I believe every word of it." Relief flooded through her, swift and overwhelming, but it was short-lived because his expression had not eased, and his next words made clear why. "But belief is not enough, Miss Whitfield, not when the talk has already spread beyond these walls. I have a daughter whose reputation will one day depend on the company she keeps, and I have a household to manage in a county where gossip, once loosed, cannot easily be called back. I do not believe a word against your character, but I cannot pretend the damage isn't done, or that it will not follow you and by extension follow Lucy wherever you remain." Margaret felt something cold settle in her chest, sharper than any insult Mrs. Cromwell had managed to land. "Are you dismissing me, Your Grace?" He did not answer immediately, and in that hesitation, Margaret read everything she needed to know. Whatever had grown between them in the fire-lit evenings of the past month, whatever unspoken understanding had begun to take root, was not, in the end, strong enough to withstand the practical machinery of reputation and rank that governed his world. He was a duke. She was a bishop's penniless, debt-shadowed daughter. Whatever she had let herself imagine in the warmth of his attention had been exactly that. Imagination, with no foundation in the realities that bound a man like him. "I think," she said quietly, before he could find whatever careful words he was searching for, "that you needn't say it aloud, Your Grace. I understand the position I have put you in, however unintentionally. I will collect Lucy's lesson materials and prepare a transition for whoever you engage next. I only ask that I might say goodbye to her properly. She has come so far. I would not have her think I abandoned her without a word." She left the library before he could respond, her composure holding until she reached the privacy of her own small room, where it finally, completely, broke. The house felt different the moment Margaret left it, emptier, though nothing of substance had changed, as though some essential warmth had been quietly extinguished the instant she closed the door of her room behind her, and began folding her few belongings into the same battered trunk she had arrived with months before. She gave herself 2 days to make her preparations, to write careful notes for Lucy's continued education, to compose a gentle, loving letter to the child herself, knowing that whatever words she might offer in person would likely fail her when the moment came. Lucy did not take the news well. She had not spoken so few words in weeks as she did in the hour after Margaret told her, gently as she could manage, that she would be leaving Ashbourne Hall. The girl's face had crumpled, not into the silent withdrawal of her earlier grief, but into something fiercer, anger, betrayal, the particular fury of a child who has only just learned to trust again and feels that trust being stolen from her a second time. "You said you wouldn't leave," Lucy said, her voice trembling. "You said good things stayed if you let them." "I did say that," Margaret answered, kneeling so they were eye to eye, fighting to keep her own voice steady. "And I believe it still. But sometimes, my darling, good things must go away for a little while before they can come back properly. This isn't because of anything you did or anything wrong with you. You must believe that." "Then why?" It was a question Margaret found she could not answer honestly without implicating the Duke, and she would not do that, not to a child who had only just begun to trust her father again after 2 years of careful, painful distance. So she offered instead the only truth she could manage. "Sometimes the world makes things complicated for grown people in ways that have nothing to do with what's right or fair. But I promise you this, Lucy, wherever I go, I will think of you every single day. And the things I've taught you, the words you found again, those belong to you now. No one can take them away, not even if I'm not here to remind you of them." It was not enough. It could never be enough. But it was all she had to give, and she gave it as fully as her breaking heart allowed. The Duke, for his part, spent those same 2 days in a state he had not experienced since the worst weeks following his wife's death. A restless, gnawing unease that followed him through every room of his own house, that made the silence of his library, once his sanctuary, feel instead like a cell of his own making. He told himself repeatedly that he had made the only reasonable decision available to him. A man in his position could not afford to ignore the practical realities of rank and reputation, however unjust those realities might be to a woman who had done nothing to deserve the scandal attached to her name. He told himself that protecting Lucy's future standing in society was worth more than his own fleeting comfort, that duty had always demanded sacrifice, and that this was simply one more sacrifice among many he had made since assuming his title. He found, to his growing frustration, that he did not believe a word of it. It was Bessie, of all people, who finally said aloud what every member of the household had been silently observing for weeks. She came to him on the second evening, ostensibly to discuss arrangements for Margaret's departure, but lingered at the library door with the particular hesitance of a servant working up the courage to speak above her station. "Begging your pardon, Your Grace," she said, twisting her apron in her hands, "but I've served this house 8 years, and I've never once seen Lady Lucy laugh the way she does when Miss Whitfield is near. Nor you, sir, if I'm honest, though I know it's not my place to say so." "It is not," he agreed, though without the sharpness such a comment might once have provoked. "No, sir, but I think someone ought to say it plainly, since everyone else seems content to let you make a terrible mistake in silence." Bessie's voice shook slightly, but she pressed on. "Mrs. Cromwell spread those lies out of spite, Your Grace, plain and simple, because she couldn't bear to see someone better than her niece take the position she'd promised away. The whole staff knows it. The whole village will know it too, soon enough, once the truth catches up with the gossip, as truth generally does. And when it does, Your Grace, you'll have sent away the one person who brought your daughter back to you, over rumors that were never true to begin with." She left before he could respond, perhaps fearing she had overstepped beyond recovery, but her words remained long after she'd gone, settling into the same restless unease that had occupied him for 2 days, until something in him, some last, stubborn wall built brick by careful brick since his wife's death, finally, completely gave way. He found Margaret in the garden the next morning, beneath the old oak Lucy called the wishing tree, her trunk already packed and waiting by the front door, the carriage arranged to take her to the village within the hour. She was not weeping, but there was a hollowness to her composure that struck him harder than tears might have. "Miss Whitfield," he said, and she turned, startled, clearly not expecting him to seek her out in these final moments. "Your Grace, I was not aware you wished to see me before I left." "I find," he said, and his voice was rougher than he intended, "that I do not wish you to leave at all." She stilled completely, her eyes searching his face for some sign of what precisely he meant by such a statement. "Your Grace, we discussed." "We discussed practicalities," he interrupted, crossing the small distance between them with the same restless urgency that had driven him from his library at dawn. "Reputation, rank, the realities of my position, every reasonable argument a sensible man might offer for protecting his daughter's future, and I believed 2 days ago that those arguments were sound enough to outweigh anything else." He stopped before her, close enough now that she had to tilt her head slightly to meet his eyes. "I was wrong. I have spent 2 days watching my daughter grieve a loss she should never have had to suffer, and watching myself grieve something I have not permitted myself to feel since the day I buried my wife, and I find, Miss Whitfield, that I would rather weather every scrap of gossip in this county than spend one more day pretending those practicalities matter more than what is true." "And what is true, Your Grace?" Her voice was barely above a whisper, though she did not look away. "That you walked into this house as a stranger I mistreated in the rain, and within a season, you have become the person without whom I cannot imagine this household, or my own life, continuing. That my daughter found her voice because you gave her the patience and safety no one else thought to offer. That I have spent every evening these past weeks finding reasons to seek your company, and telling myself it was for Lucy's sake, when I knew perfectly well it had stopped being only that some time ago." He took a breath, and for the first time since she had known him, the Duke of Ashbourne looked entirely unguarded, entirely without the careful armor he had worn since the day she'd met him kneeling in the mud. "I am asking you to stay, Margaret, not as my daughter's governess, as my wife, if you will have me, title, scandal, gossiping village, and all of it be damned." The silence that followed felt, to both of them, far longer than the few seconds it actually lasted. Margaret felt something break open in her chest, some final wall of careful self-protection she had built over 6 months of grief and uncertainty, of swallowed pride and unspoken hope. "You once ordered me to scrub your boots without even learning my name," she said finally, and there was something between laughter and tears in her voice. "I am aware," he said, "that I have a great deal of penance to perform for that particular sin." "You could begin," she said, "by telling me you love me, rather than simply implying it through speeches about practicality and gossip." He laughed then, a real laugh, warm and unguarded, the sound Bessie would later swear she'd never once heard from him in 8 years of service, and took her face gently in his hands, the same way he had taken Lucy's the day she'd found her voice again. "I love you," he said simply. "I have, I think, for longer than I allowed myself to admit. Stay, Margaret, not for Lucy's sake or mine or anyone's convenience. Stay because this house and this family and this man standing before you are nothing without you in them." And beneath the old oak that Lucy called the wishing tree, in a garden touched by the first warm light of spring after the longest winter Ashbourne Hall had ever known, Margaret Whitfield finally let herself believe that some good things, once found, were allowed to stay. A year had passed since the night Margaret Whitfield first knelt in the rain before the doors of Ashbourne Hall, and on a bright autumn morning much like any other, the new Duchess of Ashbourne stood at the same threshold, watching her husband cross the courtyard toward her with their daughter's small hand clasped firmly in his own. Lucy had grown taller, her voice no longer rusty with disuse but quick and bright, and constantly full of questions, chattering now about the new puppy the stable master had promised her, about the watercolor she intended to paint of the autumn leaves, about everything, and nothing with the boundless energy of a child fully restored to herself. The wedding, held quietly in the village church 4 months after that morning in the garden, had scandalized precisely no one. For by the time the banns were read, the truth of Mrs. Cromwell's malicious fabrications had unraveled entirely. The former housekeeper, dismissed in disgrace once her cousin, faced with the Duke's quiet but thorough investigation, admitted the whole scheme. The village that had once delighted in tearing down a stranger's reputation found itself, with the particular fickleness of small communities everywhere, equally delighted to celebrate the romance that had risen from the wreckage of that same scandal. Margaret thought of all this as she watched her husband approach, his dark coat catching the morning light, his expression entirely unlike the cold, grieving stranger who had once mistaken her for a servant in the rain. He had spent the past year rebuilding not only his relationship with his daughter, but with himself, learning slowly that allowing himself to feel joy again was not a betrayal of his grief, but its natural and necessary conclusion. "You're smiling at nothing again," he said as he reached her, releasing Lucy's hand so the girl could dash ahead toward the garden, already calling for the puppy that wasn't quite hers yet but soon would be. "I was thinking," Margaret said, slipping her arm through his, "of a particular pair of muddy boots and the insufferable man who handed them to me without bothering to learn my name. He had the grace, at least, to look faintly embarrassed even now, a full year later. I have apologized for that extensively on numerous occasions." "You have," she agreed, "and I find I have entirely forgiven you, though I confess I shall never let you forget it." "I would expect nothing less, Your Grace." He pressed a kiss to her temple, watching as their daughter's laughter carried back to them from the garden, bright and unbroken and entirely her own. "Do you know," he said quietly, "I have come to believe that the worst night of your life and the best morning of mine were, in fact, the very same evening. I have never been more ashamed of myself, nor more grateful for anything than I am for that rainstorm." Margaret looked out at the garden, at the old oak Lucy still called the wishing tree, at the life that had grown from the unlikeliest of beginnings. A misunderstanding, a humiliation, a kindness extended in the face of cruelty, and a patience that had, in the end, healed far more than a single silent child. "Some things," she said softly, echoing words she had once offered a grieving, broken man beneath that very tree, "must wait in the mud a little while before they're ready to bloom." He smiled, and together they walked into the garden, toward the sound of their daughter's laughter, toward the long and ordinary happiness that neither of them, on that first stormy night, could ever have imagined waiting for them on the other side of the rain. Thank you for listening to the story all the way to the end. Please tell us which city you're watching from and what the story made you feel. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss new stories.